Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Spirit of Islam. I'm your host Ashraf Zaghloul. And today, inshallah, we'll talk about freedom of speech versus hate. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce my guest, Mr. Mustafa Siddiqi. Assalamu alaikum, Mustafa. Mustafa, you suggested this topic. Why?
I think it's an interesting topic, especially considering what's going on in the world today. There is a constant tussle that's going on between constitutes free speech and what constitutes hate speech. Specifically in Canada, there has been certain cases that have had to deal with this, and there have been no proper guidelines as to what would define free speech to be and what would define hate speech to be.
But what do you think, when you say guidelines, do we tell people what they can say and what they can't say?
No, it's not a question of what they can say, what they can't say. The common man, everyone has a right to an opinion. Yes. Everyone has the right to speak their mind. There's nothing wrong with that. The question is how that opinion affects the populace as a whole. Now, if you're the layman and you're saying something in the street or you're having a conversation with somebody, that really doesn't have any effect on anyone. Okay. However, when you're in a position of power or you're in a position of authority or you're in a position in the media where you're relaying information about something, then it is incumbent upon that person to make sure that those facts are accurate. Now, if you are relaying information that is incorrect, or you're saying something like all Muslims are terrorists, or that the Muslim population is growing too fast and they're going to take over the world, like there's a concept right now called Eurabia, where they're saying that the Arab population is exploding in Europe, and slowly they're going to outpace the natural birthing ratio of white Europeans. So then the Muslims will end up taking over. So this is a demagoguery towards Muslims, and it's unhealthy because what it does is it fosters hate within the society.
But what if it's a fact, though? Somebody is stating a fact. It's factual statistics.
No, there's nothing wrong with stating a factual statistic. However, the problem is when you're bringing it from a point that you're saying that this is something to be wary of, this is something to be afraid of, this is something to be scared of. It's one thing to say, oh, Muslims have a high birth population versus the Western population. Yep. By the way, that's not correct. Muslims and Arabs are not actually outpacing people in Europe. That's not true. But the point is, let's say they were, like you suggested, hypothetically. If they are, then you can say, well, fine, that's statistically relevant.
Correct.
However, but how is that relevant to the, it's scaremongering, really. Like, how is that saying that all those Muslims are going to actually end up taking over? And the fact is, it ends up drawing lines and parallels, because what you're saying is that those Muslims are not European, that they're not part of it, that they should essentially go back home. So it's a form of xenophobia.
Well, let me tell you, and I meet a lot of Muslims, not all of Muslims, some of them would say, we want to live in our own society. Even they live in the West here, but they want to live in their own enclave. How do we answer this?
Well, if certain Muslims want to live in their own enclave, they have every right to. Why not?
Why don't they assimilate part of the society?
They can, but everyone has a right to be the way they want to. Let's take the Amish, for example, in the United States. They don't wish to assimilate with the rest of society. They have their own enclaves. They don't believe in technology or believe in maintaining virtue in a certain way by practicing a certain way they are. So if certain Muslims want to do that, it's fine. It's not that I would personally recommend it, but then that's their choice.
But if you took the example of the Amish, they were there hundreds of years and they lived in their own communities. They didn't come from outside in major cities like Toronto or something and then say, I want to live my own life.
Right. No, I'm not saying that, but the thing is, I think that's where that issue is. It's a question of, well, how many generations does it take for somebody to actually be American or be Canadian? I mean, are we going to say, is it one generation, is it two generations, is it three generations? If you look at the Native Americans here, they can tell everyone, well, look, we were here first. I still consider you people to be, I consider you to be an immigrant. I don't care how many generations you've been here, but you haven't assimilated into my society. I don't see you building your own reservations. You came in here and took over. So the question is as to how society perceives Muslims. That is problematic. I'm not saying that Muslims shouldn't engage society. Muslims should engage society. They should they should realize that they exist in a macrocosm. They don't exist in their own little microcosm and their own vacuum. They're not going to interact with anyone. They must interact with people. However, if there are certain few, and they are, but they're few and far between. If they want to, then that's their choice. They should have the right to. However, they should know that it is incumbent upon themselves to be engaged with the community.
Well, I always wonder, you get an immigrant or somebody who's always looking back home and say how wonderful things are back home. And I always say, if it's so nice, why don't you go back home and let us live in society the way it is? If we want to change the society to what back home was, why did we come?
I think it's just the question of it's fond memories. It really comes down to that. It's just they have a certain perception of how home life. It's the saying that the grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah.
That's what they thought when they came here. If it was wonderful there at the time, then they wouldn't have moved here.
Of course.
And when they're here, you see. I mean, so you can't. Everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too, and that simply won't happen. But specifically speaking, but the problem is that when people consider these opinions that Muslims have to be tried and true, that all Muslims hold it, then this ends up becoming problematic because they think that all Muslims are like that, and that isn't good.
So where do they get the impression? Is it us because we're not, the silent majority is not talking out? Or, obviously they've built an opinion based on some kind of facts or something.
See, this is a dicey question because it falls into two categories. The first category you have to say is, like you say, the silent majority. The other category happens to deal with Muslim engagement. With the silent majority, people don't feel that it's necessary because people like to deal with their own daily lives. They want to go to work, they want to make money, they want to have a family, and they want to enjoy life, which is what most people endeavor to do. The second is the more engaged populace, the people who feel like we have to be there, we have to engage the populace, we have to do dawah. And they are there, but they're a small amount. Now, the problem with these groups is that Muslims have not yet become sophisticated enough as per media and communication and PR to be able to properly express what they're about and and what their beliefs are and how they are a part of that community. The problem is that what people generally tend to rely on is, and I hate to say this is somewhat trite and cliched, but on Hollywood or TV, and what they do is they borrow stereotypes and Orientalist views about what Muslims are. They'll take certain conflicts and they say, well, this is what Muslims are about, and then we allow them to speak on our behalf and create an image and persona about what Muslims are, but that's not correct.
Well, I always say about this point, for the last 50, 60 years, we've seen movies about Muslims or Arabs being terrorists. And we as Muslims have paid to watch this movie, and we say, great action movie. And we pay, instead of saying, no, this is not us. So come 50 years later, we're waking up and say, where did people get this impression? It's these movies we've been supporting, paying for, and in the Muslim countries, they're there on the, on their movie theaters. And people do not link cause and effect. Don't think that because he paid that $5 or $10 or $15 to watch that movie, he is stressing that message.
Well, that's true, and that's exactly the point when you're coming down to that whole aspect, because you're allowing other voices to speak to you, and that's the whole problem. It's not that free speech is an issue. Free speech is right. It's not just right. It's a fundamental belief or core value of this country and that everyone should support. However, given that, there are responsibilities with that. And with free speech, that doesn't mean that you come up with something that isn't factual. When you hear people like Mark Stein or Ashraf Zaghloul, and they're making up statements that aren't quite correct, or not even aren't correct at all, and they're demagoguing the entire populace and stereotyping them, that's not correct, because now we're allowing another voice like them to take over and say, hey, this is what it is. We should be able to say what we want to say unchallenged, and what we're saying shouldn't be challenged at all. And those things, those sort of views and opinions must be challenged.
Okay, how do we challenge it? I agree with you, must be challenged. How do we challenge it?
There's several ways you can challenge them. Firstly, Muslims should educate themselves. You can't be a passive participant.
Yes.
There's no such thing as a passive participant. Like you said, everyone likes to have a vigorous conversation and in coffee shops and at home. Yeah. But when it comes out and actually going out to the media or writing letters, we don't do that. So it's important that we educate ourselves first, know what the issues are, then we can speak intelligently about it. Not to get caught up in emotion, because a lot of us do, and we shoot from the hip and we don't think, hey, maybe we should think this through properly. The other aspect is, like I said, getting involved in writing letters. This TV show, for example, is another form of media. Get involved in the media. There's nothing wrong with that. It's important, and use the money and the wealth that you earn, and use it towards things that are going to help the cause. Well, just like you said, don't buy movie tickets in theaters, because that's basically saying, hey, you know what, it works, it sells.
I'm not saying don't go to theaters. I'm saying choose the movies you
watch. Exactly.
But if the movie is giving a subliminal message, Muslims are bad, Muslim and terrorists, and you pay the money, you're supporting
exactly them. And you shouldn't do that. And you should say, hey, you know what, this isn't right. Or either that, or write to the people and say, hey, your information isn't correct. It's not accurate. Yep. So, I mean, this wouldn't be allowed for any other group, but Muslims, for some reason, it's become allowable, it's become tolerable. Half the things that are said, and not just media, but just the general public, about, and the opinion that they have of Muslims, is become completely allowable.
But let me put it to you in a different way.